In 1994, police broke down a farmhouse door in Missouri, and what they found inside a hidden wall would finally explain the disappearance of a sheriff from 4 years earlier. It all began in 1990, on a quiet Tuesday, in a small town where nothing ever happened. Sheriff Joe Dalton had just retired. He had served for 35 years, a rock in a community that trusted him completely. His retirement party was 2 days before he vanished. The whole town came out. There were speeches, a cake with a badly drawn sheriff's badge on it, and a gold watch he joked he'd never use because he finally had all the time in the world. He stood beside his wife, Sarah, a woman whose smile was as much a town fixture as the courthouse clock. He promised her they would travel, see the Grand Canyon, maybe buy a small boat for the lake. He was done with the violence, the late-night calls, the weight of other people's tragedies. He was ready for peace. The morning he disappeared was just like any other. Sarah had left early to visit her sister in the next town over. She'd kissed him goodbye while he was still half asleep. He was supposed to spend the day working on the small wooden shed in their backyard, a project he'd been putting off for years. When Sarah came home that evening, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't like Joe. He was a man of habits, and locking the door was one he never broke, even in a town this safe. She called his name. No answer. She walked into the kitchen and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. On the table sat a single coffee mug, half full, now cold. Beside it was a plate with a piece of toast, one bite taken out of it. The butter was still soft on the counter. It was a perfect picture of a life interrupted, a moment frozen in time. She checked the backyard. The tools for the shed project were laid out neatly on a tarp, but nothing had been touched. The wood was still stacked, clean and waiting. His car, a reliable old Ford, was in the driveway. His wallet and keys were on the hook by the door where he always left them. It was as if he had simply stepped out of his life, mid-bite, mid-sip, and vanished into thin air. Panic began to creep in, cold and sharp. This wasn't right. Joe wasn't a man who just left. He was the man people called when they were lost. He wasn't the one who went missing. Sarah called the station, her voice trembling. The new sheriff, Mark, had been Joe's deputy for 10 years. He was more like a son to Joe than a subordinate. He heard the fear in Sarah's voice and was at the house in less than 10 minutes. Mark saw the same scene Sarah had. The cold coffee, the uneaten toast, the unlocked door. His stomach tightened. This was wrong on a level he couldn't yet define. It wasn't a crime scene. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. Everything was in its place, pristine and orderly, except for the man who was supposed to be there. It felt more disturbing than a ransacked house. It felt like an erasure. The search started immediately. Mark organized teams to sweep the woods behind the Dalton house. They used search dogs, but the dogs lost the scent at the edge of the driveway, as if Joe had been lifted straight into the sky. They interviewed every neighbor on the street. No one saw anything unusual. Mrs. Gable from across the road said she saw Joe getting his newspaper from the porch around 7 in the morning, same as always. He waved. He was wearing his favorite flannel shirt. He seemed perfectly fine. After that, nothing. The mailman came and went. A delivery truck passed by. Life went on, but Joe Dalton was gone. The first 24 hours were a blur of confusion and growing dread. Mark and his deputies went over the house again and again, looking for any clue, any tiny detail that was out of place. But the house was a fortress of normalcy. The only thing missing was Joe. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the coffee cup. She couldn't bring herself to wash it. It was the last thing he had touched. It felt like a sacred object, a final link to the man she had loved for 40 years. She kept replaying their last conversation in her head. It was about nothing important. About what to have for dinner. About the weather. Normal things. How could a normal day swallow a man whole? Days turned into a week. The official search was scaled back. The news crews that had camped out on their lawn packed up and left. The story of the missing retired sheriff faded from the headlines, replaced by other news. But for Sarah and Mark, the search never ended. It just went quiet. Mark spent his nights poring over Joe's old case files, thinking maybe an old grudge had finally caught up with him. Joe had put a lot of people away over 35 years. But every lead went cold. Every old enemy had an alibi, or was still in prison. It was a perfect mystery with no beginning and no end. Sarah kept the house exactly as he had left it. She dusted his chair, she watered his plants. She left the light on the porch every night, just in case he was trying to find his way home. Hope became a form of torture. Every time the phone rang, her heart would leap. Every time a car that looked like his drove down the street, she would rush to the window. But it was never him. A year passed. Then, 2. The town moved on. A new family moved in next door. The world kept spinning. But Sarah's world had stopped on that Tuesday morning in 1990. She became a ghost in her own home, surrounded by the memories of a man who was now more of a myth than a memory. Mark visited her every week. He'd bring groceries, fix a leaky faucet, and sit with her in silence. He felt a profound sense of failure. He had inherited Joe's badge, his office, his responsibilities. But he couldn't solve the one case that mattered most. He couldn't bring his mentor home. The case file for Joe Dalton grew thicker with reports of dead ends and false sightings. It sat on the corner of Mark's desk, a constant silent accusation. Sometimes he would open it and just stare at Joe's picture, at the kind eyes and the steady smile. "Where did you go, Joe?" he would think. "What happened in that quiet house, on that quiet morning?" The absence of violence was the most violent thing about it. It left a hole that nothing could fill. There was no body to mourn, no killer to hate, no justice to seek. There was only the gaping void of the unknown. And then, 4 years later, in the summer of 1994, a phone call changed everything. It came from a detective in a rural county in Missouri, a place Joe had never even been to. The detective's name was Harris. He sounded young, professional. He said they had arrested a man named Caleb Thorne on a robbery charge. Thorne was a strange man, unnervingly calm. During the arrest, he didn't resist. He just smiled. It was a smile that made the hair on the back of Harris's neck stand up. There was nothing in Thorne's record to suggest he was anything more than a small-time thief, but Harris had a gut feeling. He called it a hunter's instinct. This man was more than he seemed. Based on that hunch, they got a warrant to search Thorne's property, a rundown farmhouse miles from anywhere. They were looking for stolen goods from the robbery. They didn't expect to find anything else. But Caleb Thorne was not a simple man. He was a collector. The raid on the farmhouse began on a hot, sticky afternoon. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The house itself was eerily neat. The floors were swept. The dishes were clean. It was the home of a man who liked order. The deputies searched room by room, the living room, the kitchen, the bedrooms. They found nothing related to the robbery. They found nothing illegal at all. It was a perfectly boring house. They were about to give up when they went down to the basement. The basement was stone-walled, damp, and smelled of bleach. It was empty except for an old furnace and some shelves with jars of preserved vegetables. It looked completely normal. One of the younger deputies, a kid fresh out of the academy, was tapping on the walls, a habit he'd picked up from old detective movies. He was mostly doing it as a joke. Tap, tap, tap on the solid stone. And then, in one corner, Behind the furnace, the sound changed. It wasn't the dull thud of stone. It was a hollow echo. He tapped again, his heart starting to beat faster. He called over Detective Harris. Harris listened. The sound was unmistakable. There was something behind that wall. They got a sledgehammer from the truck. The first blow sent a spider web of cracks through the plaster that had been expertly applied to look like stone. The second blow broke through. A wave of stale, cold air washed over them, carrying a faint, sweet smell, like old paper and dried flowers. It was a smell that didn't belong in a damp basement. They tore away the rest of the false wall, revealing a dark opening. It was a room, no bigger than a closet, a hidden room. Harris shone his flashlight inside, and the beam cut through decades of darkness. For a moment, no one spoke. They just stared, trying to understand what they were seeing. Inside the room, standing in the center, was a mannequin. It was dressed in a sheriff's uniform, the fabric perfectly pressed, the creases sharp. On the chest, catching the light from the flashlight, was a silver badge. It was tarnished with age, but still gleamed. On a small wooden table next to the mannequin sat a service revolver, cleaned and polished to a mirror shine. And beside the gun, there was a small rectangular box made of dark wood, sealed with a brass latch. The air in the basement grew heavy, charged with a sudden, terrible understanding. This wasn't a thief's hideout. It was a shrine. It was a tomb of memory. Harris stepped into the room, his boots crunching on the dusty floor. He leaned in to look at the badge. The name engraved on it was clear: Sheriff Joe Dalton. The name meant nothing to Harris, but he knew it was important. He knew in his gut that they had just stumbled into a story much darker and older than a simple robbery. He radioed it in. He asked dispatch to run the name. An hour later, the call came to Sheriff Mark's office in that quiet town, hundreds of miles away. Mark was at his desk, staring at Joe's cold case file, when the phone rang. He listened to the Missouri detective describe the hidden room, the uniform, the badge. Mark's hand tightened on the receiver. The world around him seemed to slow down. After 4 years of silence, 4 years of nothing, the case had just broken wide open in the most horrifying way imaginable. He told Harris he was on his way. He hung up the phone and stood there for a long moment, the silence of his office pressing in on him. Then he walked over to the window and looked out at the town that Joe had protected for so long. The illusion of peace was shattered. The monster they had looked for in their own backyards had been living in a farmhouse in Missouri all along. Mark drove all night. He didn't stop for food or rest. The highway became a blur of headlights and darkness. His mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. Who was Caleb Thorne? Why would he have Joe's uniform? Was he in that house somewhere? The thought was a cold spike of fear in his chest. He arrived in Missouri as the sun was rising. The farmhouse was cordoned off with yellow tape. It looked like any other old house, weathered and tired. But now Mark knew what it was hiding. It was a place of secrets, a place of profound evil. He met Detective Harris, a man whose tired eyes showed he hadn't slept either. Harris led him down to the basement. The smell hit him first, that strange, cloying smell of dust and decay and something else he couldn't name. And then he saw it, the room. The uniform on the mannequin, Joe's uniform. He recognized the small tear on the sleeve that Sarah had meticulously patched up years ago. He saw the badge, the one Joe had pinned on him when he was promoted to deputy. It was like seeing a ghost. Mark felt a wave of nausea and grief so strong he had to lean against the stone wall to steady himself. This was real. After all this time, this was real. Harris pointed to the wooden box on the table. "We haven't opened it," he said. "We waited for you." They took the box upstairs to a makeshift evidence table in the kitchen. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, and surprisingly heavy. The brass latch was cold to the touch. With a pair of evidence tweezers, Mark carefully lifted the latch. The lid opened with a soft creak. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was Joe's wallet. Mark recognized the worn leather, the faded imprint of the badge Joe used to carry in it. He opened it. Joe's driver's license stared up at him, his face smiling, healthy. Behind it were the familiar photos Joe always carried. Sarah on their wedding day, their son as a little boy, a picture of Mark himself, young and proud in his new deputy uniform. Seeing those pictures, those stolen moments of a good man's life, sitting in this monster's house, was a violation that words couldn't describe. It was a theft of memory, a theft of a soul. But there was something else in the box. Underneath the wallet was a single Polaroid photograph, face down. Mark's hand trembled as he picked it up. He turned it over, and the breath left his body. The world tilted on its axis. The photograph showed Joe Dalton. He was alive. He was sitting in a wooden chair, the same kind of chair that was in the farmhouse kitchen. He was tied to it with thick rope. His face was bruised. A cut above his eye was bleeding, but his expression was not one of fear. It was one of pure, defiant rage. His eyes stared into the camera with a fire that even his captor couldn't extinguish. And standing behind the chair with one hand on Joe's shoulder was Caleb Thorne. He was smiling. The same empty, chilling smile the arresting officers had described. It was a smile of ownership, of triumph. This was his prize. This was his collection. Mark flipped the photo over. On the back, written in neat, precise handwriting, was a date. It was 2 days after Joe had disappeared. 2 days. That meant Joe hadn't been killed immediately. He had been taken. He had been a prisoner in this house. For how long? Days? Weeks? The thought was unbearable. They had been searching the woods, thinking he had wandered off or met with a quick, violent end. But he had been here, alive, suffering, at the mercy of this man. The photograph was the key. It was proof, but it was also a new kind of hell. It answered the question of what had happened, but it opened up 100 more. Why Joe? How did Thorne get him from his home without anyone seeing? And the most important question of all, where was Joe now? The search of the farmhouse intensified. They tore the place apart, board by board. They dug up the yard. They drained the nearby pond. But they found no body, no remains. It was as if Caleb Thorne had collected Joe's life, his identity, his final moments, and then made his body disappear. Mark was tasked with the interrogation. He sat across from Caleb Thorne in a small gray room. Thorne was a small man, physically unimposing. He had thinning hair and pale, watery eyes. He looked like an accountant, not a monster. But when he looked at Mark, there was a knowing emptiness in his gaze that was terrifying. Mark placed the Polaroid on the table between them. "I want to know where he is," Mark said, his voice low and steady. Thorne looked at the photo, then at Mark. A small smile played on his lips. He was a strong man. Thorne said, his voice soft, almost conversational, very proud. He didn't break easily. The casual cruelty of the remark hit Mark like a physical blow. He fought to keep his composure. "Where is his body, Caleb?" Thorne leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. He was enjoying this. He was in control. A good sheriff knows his land. Thorne said, his voice a sly whisper. "He always told me that. You should know your land too, Sheriff." And that was all he would say. He repeated the phrase over and over, like a mantra. A good sheriff knows his land. He wouldn't confess. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He had his secrets, his collection, and he would keep the final piece for himself. Mark returned home with the uniform, the badge, the wallet, and the photograph. He had to deliver the news to Sarah. It was the hardest thing he had ever had to do. He sat with her in her quiet living room, the house still a perfect shrine to a man who was never coming back. He told her everything. He showed her the photograph. He thought it would break her. But when she saw the defiant look in Joe's eyes, a strange strength seemed to fill her. She touched the image of her husband's face. "He never let them win," she whispered. "Even at the end, he never let them see his fear." She was right. Joe's final act was one of defiance. He had been stolen, beaten, and killed, but he had not been broken. That knowledge was a small, cold comfort in a vast sea of grief. Caleb Thorne was convicted of kidnapping and murder, based on the overwhelming evidence found in his house. The photograph was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He never showed any remorse. He just sat in the courtroom with that same empty smile. But the mystery wasn't over. Thorne's last words to Mark haunted him. "A good sheriff knows his land." What did it mean? Was it just a meaningless taunt? Or was it a clue? Mark couldn't let it go. It was the only thread he had left to pull. He started thinking about Joe's land. Not the property the house was on, but his territory. The county he had watched over for 35 years. Mark spent weeks driving the back roads, visiting the places Joe used to patrol. He talked to old-timers, people who remembered Joe from way back. He was looking for a place, a hidden place, a forgotten place, a place only a man who knew the land inside and out would know about. He remembered a story Joe had told him once, years ago, on a long, boring stakeout. It was a story about his early days as a deputy. He'd been chasing a couple of kids who had stolen a car. The chase ended at an old abandoned farmstead way out in the northern part of the county. The kids had ditched the car and run into the woods. Joe had tracked them to an old, dry well on the property. The kids had tried to hide down there. Joe had laughed as he told the story, how he just sat at the top of the well and waited them out. "You've got to know the land," Joe had said. "Every nook and cranny. People think they can hide, but there's always a place only the land remembers." The memory hit Mark with the force of a revelation. The old farmstead, the well. He got the county records. The property had been abandoned since the 50s. No one had lived there for decades. It was a forgotten place. Mark drove out there, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The farmstead was barely visible from the road, overgrown with weeds and thorny bushes. The house had long since collapsed into a pile of rotting timber. He found the well near the back of the property, just as Joe had described it. It was covered with thick wooden planks, nailed shut and overgrown with ivy. It looked like it hadn't been touched in a lifetime. But Mark noticed something. The nails holding the planks down were old and rusted, but a few of them looked newer than the others. They were less corroded, driven deeper into the wood. Someone had been here. Someone had sealed this well up again, more recently than 50 years ago. He got a crowbar from his trunk. The old wood splintered and groaned as he pried it open. When the last plank came free, he was hit with a blast of cold, musty air from the darkness below. It was the smell of the grave. He shone his flashlight down into the blackness. The well was deep, maybe 30 feet. At the bottom, partially covered by dirt and rocks that had fallen in over the years, was a shape, a human shape. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he had found him. He had brought Joe home. The recovery took hours. They had to bring in a specialized team. They carefully lowered a man down into the well, and piece by piece, they brought Joe Dalton back into the light. The remains were sent for forensic analysis, but Mark didn't need a report to tell him what he already knew. They had found him. Caleb Thorne had not buried his victim in his own backyard. That would have been too simple. He was a man of twisted poetry. He had taken the sheriff, the guardian of the land, and buried him in a forgotten corner of that same land, turning Joe's own knowledge against him. He had made the sheriff's final resting place, a secret that only the sheriff himself would have known. It was his final, cruel joke. The funeral was held a week later. The whole town came, just as they had for his retirement party. But this time, there was no cake, no laughter. There was only a quiet, somber grief. They buried him in the town cemetery, on a hill overlooking the community he had served. Sarah stood at the graveside, holding Mark's arm. She was frail, aged by the years of uncertainty, but her eyes were clear. She had finally laid her husband to rest. There was a sense of peace, of closure, but the questions would always remain. How did Thorne choose Joe? How did a small-time thief from Missouri find his way to a retired sheriff in another state? The investigation into Thorne's life revealed a horrifying pattern. He was a predator who moved across the country, targeting people who represented something he coveted. A firefighter in Ohio, a teacher in Illinois, a doctor in Kentucky. He would study them, learn their routines, and then he would strike. He took trophies from each one, a helmet, a textbook, a stethoscope. He collected their lives, their identities, and stored them in his house of horrors. But Joe Dalton was different. He was the prize of his collection. A sheriff, the ultimate symbol of authority and order. By capturing and killing Joe, Thorne felt he had captured a piece of that power for himself. He had proven he was smarter, stronger than the law itself. They believed Thorne found Joe by chance. He was likely passing through the town, saw the "Congratulations Sheriff Dalton" signs from the retirement party, and became obsessed. He would have watched the house for days, learning the routine. He saw Sarah leave that morning and knew it was his chance. He likely approached the house under some pretext. A lost driver, a man in need of help. Joe, being the man he was, would have offered assistance without a second thought, and that was his mistake. He trusted one person too many. He let the monster in the door. After the funeral, Mark went back to his office. He took Joe's case file, now thick with the final reports, and placed it in the archives. It was closed, but it would never be finished. He opened the evidence locker and looked at the items recovered from Thorne's farmhouse. The uniform, the badge, the wallet. They were just objects, but they held the weight of a stolen life. They told a story of a good man's final days, of unimaginable cruelty, and of a quiet defiance that could not be extinguished. Mark picked up the badge. It felt heavy in his hand. He thought of Joe, of his kindness, his strength, his dedication. He thought of Sarah's quiet dignity in the face of so much pain. And he thought of Caleb Thorne, sitting in a concrete cell, smiling his empty smile, holding on to the one secret he would never give up: the why. Some things can never be fully understood. Some darkness is too deep to be illuminated. The case was solved, the killer was behind bars, and the body was home. But the echo of that empty house on that quiet morning would never truly fade. It served as a permanent reminder that evil can wear the most ordinary face, and that sometimes the greatest mysteries are not about who did it or how, but about the simple, terrifying fact that it happened at all. The town slowly healed, but it was never quite the same. The story of Sheriff Dalton became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to children about the dangers of talking to strangers. The unlocked doors in the town were now always locked. The sense of perfect safety was gone, replaced by a new, hard-won awareness of the world's sharp edges. Sarah lived out her years in the same house, the ghost of her husband a constant, comforting presence. She never remarried. She said she had already had a lifetime of love with Joe. Mark continued as sheriff, older now and wiser. He carried the weight of Joe's legacy with him every day. He knew the land, just as Joe had. He knew its secrets, its beauty, and its darkness. And he knew that justice is not always about victory. Sometimes, it's just about finding your way home. Years later, Caleb Thorne died in prison of a heart attack. He never spoke of Joe Dalton again. He took his motives, his reasons, his final secrets to the grave, leaving behind only a collection of stolen lives and the lingering question that would forever hang over that small town. The hidden room in the Missouri farmhouse was dismantled, its contents logged as evidence in a crime that was now a part of history. But the memory of what was found inside, the pristine uniform, the polished gun, the photograph of a defiant man, served as a chilling testament to the meticulous, patient evil of a collector who didn't just take lives, but curated them. The story ends there, in the quiet archives of a sheriff's department, in the silence of a prison cell, and in the stillness of a grave on a hill. A story of a good man who vanished, and the terrible truth that was found, years later, hidden behind a wall. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.